Welcome to Mind Shield. We protect the mind and pursue the truth. Let's get started.
Project Mind Shield is a proposal for the investigation of perception and physiological correlates of low-level pulsed RF exposure. At its core, this project asks a hard question that most institutions avoid because it sounds strange. If people report repeatable auditory, vestibular, and neurological effects that resemble known radiofrequency bioeffects, can those reports be tested under controlled scientific conditions? This is not a project built on assumption. It is a project built on measurement. Not belief, not dismissal, measurement. The central premise is simple. If a phenomenon is real, then it should leave signatures, in the body, in the environment, or in both. Project Mind Shield exists to bring a disciplined research framework to a domain that has largely been trapped between anecdote and stigma. In February 2026, a reported Norway incident pushed this discussion out of the theoretical and into the concrete. According to the framing in this presentation, a scientist used a microwave device on his own brain to test susceptibility, and the resulting symptoms included severe vertigo, nausea, disorientation, and the auditory perception of energy. Why does that matter? Because those symptoms closely resemble the profile seen in anomalous health incident reporting. The significance here is not sensationalism, it is correlation. When an event is reported that appears to recreate the same clinical pattern associated with prior unexplained incidents, it creates a sharper research target. It gives us a more defined hypothesis space. In other words, the question becomes less, could this ever happen? And more, what exactly should we measure when it does? This presentation places the problem in a larger timeline. Since 2016, U.S. diplomats and intelligence personnel have reported sudden neurological symptoms in Havana. Similar concern later emerged in Guangzhou, then in reporting connected to Vienna and Washington. The deck highlights 3 key points in that chain. First, there is a documented phenomenon of unexplained sudden neurological injury. Second, the 2020 National Academies report identified directed, pulsed radiofrequency energy as a plausible mechanism. Third, later technical work, including the JSON-related framing referenced here, reinforced that pulsed RF could produce effects consistent with the reported symptom pattern, including auditory features associated with the fray effect. So the larger context is this: we are no longer dealing with a vacuum. We have incident clusters, medical concern, and a plausible physical mechanism. What we do not yet have is a clean, repeatable bridge between the reported exposure environment and the measured biological response. This deck uses the term CNSI, computational neuro-sensory interface. That term is meant to describe the intersection of 3 domains: RF physics, neuroscience, and computing. Why this framing? Because any serious discussion of remote neurosensory interaction cannot live inside one silo. RF physics covers transmission and coupling. Neuroscience covers how tissue, nerves, and perception respond. Computing covers signal processing, interpretation, and control. Within that framework, the presentation identifies 2 broad operational directions. One is input, remote neural surveillance or decoding of biosignals. The other is output, inducing auditory perception, vestibular disruption, or cognitive interference. The research question at the bottom of this slide is the real engine of the project. Does current technology allow the remote decoding or encoding of neural signals at a distance? Project Mind Shield does not pretend to answer that in advance. It proposes a way to test the boundaries of that claim. The physical anchor of this presentation is the microwave auditory effect, often called the fray effect. The basic mechanism proposed here is thermoelastic expansion. Pulsed microwave radiation is absorbed by cranial tissues, creates an extremely small and rapid temperature change, and that change generates a pressure wave that is conducted to the cochlea. The result is perception of sound, clicks, buzzes, or other internally perceived auditory events. What matters scientifically is that this is not just folklore. It gives us a mechanism with parameters. Pulse width matters. Pulse repetition rate matters. Peak power matters. Coupling geometry matters. The slide also argues that modern research suggests high power, short-duration microwave pulses may produce measurable neuropathological and vestibular effects. That makes the research design obvious. If there is a mechanism, then exposure conditions and physiological response need to be measured together, not separated into different institutional boxes. This slide makes an uncomfortable but necessary point. The idea of electromagnetic interaction with human perception did not appear out of nowhere. The presentation references a long arc of inquiry, from the Moscow signal era to MKUltra adjacent projects, and classified studies into biological effects of electromagnetic exposure. Now, to stay intellectually honest, historical inquiry is not proof of present-day deployment. A patent is not proof of field use. A classified study is not proof of a weapon in operation. But history does establish intent, curiosity, and investment. It shows that governments and defense institutions have spent decades asking whether human physiology and perception can be influenced through electromagnetic means. That matters because serious research should not begin from amnesia. It should begin by recognizing that this question has a lineage. This slide shifts from theory to engineering concepts. It references Project Medusa, described as a U.S. Navy-funded system aimed at transmitting sound into a target's head using the microwave auditory effect. It references Project Epic, tied here to vestibular disruption, and the active denial system, which demonstrates that RF energy can be directed precisely enough to create reliable physiological effects. Again, caution matters. Prototype does not mean deployment. Patent does not mean widespread capability. But together, these examples serve a purpose. They show that the general class of directed energy interaction with the human body is technically thinkable and, in some cases, experimentally demonstrated. So the question for a university is not whether every claim is true. The question is whether a sufficiently credible technical basis exists to justify controlled investigation. This presentation argues that it does. This is the human rights and reporting layer of the problem. The presentation argues that thousands of civilians globally describe symptoms that resemble the same cluster reported by diplomats and official personnel: directional voices or sounds, burning sensations, heating, sleep disruption, and forced physiological stress. The tension here is obvious. When high-status victims report these effects, they are treated as possible anomalous health incidents. When civilians report similar experiences, they are often categorized as psychologically disordered before environmental investigation even begins. Project MIND SHIELD is not asking a university to validate every claim. It is asking the institution to investigate whether a subset of these reports may involve measurable environmental correlates that have been ignored. That is a very different and much more scientific proposition. This slide is the hinge of the entire deck. On one side, we have physics, known RF bioeffects, including the fray mechanism. On the other side, we have victim reporting, diplomats, officials, and civilians describing symptom clusters. What is missing is the environmental link under controlled conditions. That gap has consequences. Medical professionals often treat the symptom, migraine, dizziness, psychosis, traumatic brain injury, without investigating the exposure environment. As a result, the environmental hypothesis is either neglected or dismissed before data is gathered. The opportunity, then, is to move from anecdote to evidence. Not by declaring certainty, but by building protocols that can detect, disconfirm, or constrain the possibility of a real signal. That is where Project MIND SHIELD lives. The mission is direct: conduct a research study on the perception and physiological correlates of low-level pulsed RF exposure. The core goal is equally clear: to prove or disprove the presence of CNSI-related phenomena in self-identified subjects under rigorous double-blind conditions. That last phrase matters, double-blind. Because if this work is going to survive serious scrutiny, it cannot rely on expectation, suggestion, or confirmation bias. The philosophy stated here is unusually important. Err on the side of the audience having more expertise and interest. In other words, assume the reviewers are smart, skeptical, and tired of hand-waving. Good, they should be. This project is designed for that room. This slide introduces the method. A verified RF anechoic chamber, constructed to eliminate environmental noise and isolate exposure conditions. The subject would sit within a controlled test chamber using RF shielding, with double-blind procedures and external observation. The idea is to create a clean baseline and then test for responses to specific pulsed frequency conditions consistent with historical Frey effect parameters. Why is this so important? Because the modern electromagnetic environment is a swamp of noise: Wi-Fi, cellular signals, radar, electronics, reflections, harmonics. If you want to investigate low-level pulsed effects, you cannot do it in a messy environment and then act surprised when nothing is clear. This chamber is not theatrical packaging. It is the foundation of experimental credibility. Here the project lays out its three-channel detection strategy. First, RF scanning, using wideband spectrum analyzers to monitor the environment during reported episodes and search for anomalous emissions. Second, neuroimaging and electrophysiology, real-time EEG to identify synchronization, entrainment, or novel potentials in response to RF pulses. Third, biomarkers, pre- and post-exposure blood panels to look for markers of oxidative stress and trauma, with reference to patterns associated with anomalous health incident literature. This is the right instinct scientifically. Do not trust a single instrument. Correlate across layers. Environment, brain, body. If an effect is real, you want convergence. If it is not real, you want clean null results. Either outcome is valuable. This slide presents the project as a three-part test. Part A, validation. Can a controlled pulsed frequency reproduce reported effects? If yes, that is a major step. Part B, the biological trace. Can objective evidence be captured in physiological or biochemical markers? Brain state, vestibular response, or post-exposure biomarkers. Part C, exclusion. Can mundane explanations be ruled out? Ordinary psychiatric conditions, environmental confounds, suggestion effects, or unrelated medical factors? That structure is elegant because it does not depend on hype. It asks three clean questions: can it happen? What does it leave behind? And what else could explain it? That is how weird claims stop being weird and start becoming research. This is the institutional pitch. The deck argues that NATO and global defense bodies are already defining cognitive warfare as a domain, while the academic world must define the ethical boundaries of human mental privacy and freedom. That is the neurorights argument in plain language. If technologies exist that can influence perception, cognition, or sensory experience without consent, then the university has a duty to help define the scientific and ethical perimeter. Why this university? Because the presentation argues that the necessary disciplines already converge here: engineering, neuroscience, medicine, and ethics. If that is true, then this institution is not being asked to chase a fringe topic. It is being asked to lead where others are too cautious, too siloed, or too politically allergic to look. I'll close with the core principle of Project Mind Shield. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when the tools, protocols, and institutional will to test the question have been missing. This proposal is not asking for belief. It is asking for permission to measure. It is asking for IRB review, an initial seed of funding, and the opportunity to bring rigor into a domain where too many people have chosen either fantasy or dismissal. The final thought is this: investigating CNSI is not just a technical question, it is a human one. If there is nothing there, then good science can say so. If there is something there, then the cost of refusing to look is enormous. Project Mind Shield exists because invisible harm is still harm, and because the university is one of the last places left that can test the strange without flinching.